But what we're going to do is Scott Miller is here. Scott is a former member of the South Kingston School Committee, former chair of the South Kingston School Committee, served on our executive board for a number of years, and served in every office or capacity, including president of the association. Scott is a professor at Rhode Island College. He has facilitated a lot of our professional development in the past, and he's going to talk us through a little bit of what's going on and the changes between Massachusetts or the contrast and compare the proposed changes for Rhode Island governance with what's happening in Mass. The one thing, and we've talked about this several years, we had a chairs meeting earlier this year on it, about getting school committees out of the hiring business. And that's in there. That's a proposal that's in there. This legislation takes it a step further. It kind of takes away that power from superintendents to appoint building teachers or building custodians that is now going to be invested in the principal at the school site. So there are a lot of questions, a lot of answers. There are a lot of answers yet to be answered. But I'm going to ask Scott to take this.
So this is a facilitated conversation. This is an opportunity for you to hear something about the bill that is being introduced and to provide some feedback about that, raising either questions or concerns. So I'm going to try to summarize the major features, and then Tim's role is going to be to say, yep, Scott, you got it, or not, as the case may be. The legislation, if I were trying to summarize the legislation, what I would say is this is a site-based management proposal. This is not a brand new idea. When I was first elected to the school committee in 1992, the idea had been around for about 10 years, and it had been tried out in a number of places. It was relatively new, but we can't say that anymore. Massachusetts largely adopted site-based management. It's a core feature of the initiative that has brought Massachusetts to the level of student performance where they're rated first in the country. Critical ingredients in that. First, as Tim said, it gets school committees out of the business of personnel. Our current language of advice and consent on appointments is abrogated, and we move that function down to the school level, with the school-based administrator being responsible in conjunction with the superintendent, but it's basically school-based. This isn't a radical proposal for many school districts. In South Kingstown, all appointments are acted on by the school committee because it's the state law. So we put it on the consent agenda. We agree to never talk about who the people are. And so it gets acted on in accord with the law, but we don't get involved in personnel. And there are a number of communities that have done exactly the same thing. That's not true in all communities. And so if that's a radical change in your community, it will feel very different. Second key element is that it moves the budget process out of the school committee in terms of development and down into each of the school programs, school buildings. And so you have principals building budget proposals in conjunction with the superintendent, and it comes to the school committee only after that at the program level development. Personnel matters now get dealt with at the level of the school. So school deals with hiring, deals with firing and discipline. That in some communities not radically different. Superintendent may take actions, but it isn't done without full consent and involvement of principals, but that may not be what's happening in your community. Last piece of this is it requires the development of a site-based team. And it lays out the membership of that. In high schools, it involves a student. It routinely involves representatives of each of the categories of employees in the building, as well as people who are outside of the program. So it involves parents, and it may involve other people in the community, with a limit of no more than 50% outside of the building. So the folks in the building exercise primary control. So that's my thumbnail on it. What would you say to add or correct that?
Well, like everything else, it's a work in progress, and there are going to be some issues that we have to deal with. If I could recommend to the principals, and there's going to have to be a very substantial investment in professional development for building administrators. And you may witness a number of people deciding to return to the classroom because they don't want the added responsibility that will come with this legislation. So we may be facing a shortage of principals to step up to the plate and take control of their schools. But with those principals that are left, and coming from the perspective that school committees are quite involved with the collective bargaining process, I would strongly urge the first thing that a principal should do is read the contract. Because if they're not aware of what the provisions of that collective bargaining agreement contain, because the grievances end up in your lap. So if somebody's going to grieve and it's going to go to arbitration, it's going to be the school committee and central office that's going to have to sort it out. So if you've got a visionary educational leader at the school building, but is quite ignorant as to what the ramifications of some of their decisions are going to be, you're going to end up having to clean it up. Now, it does have provisions that allow for the superintendent to review some of those decisions by the school principal. I think Neil alluded to the fact that the fastest growing population in the state are Latinos, and the biggest achievement gap is with the Latino population. So if you're a school-based site-based management program, tends to make hires that are not cognizant or aware of that teacher being able to deal with a multilingual student population, you're going to find yourself in a box. So I think there's going to be, the biggest problem I see is going to be professional development for those building principals. The other one, to be perfectly honest, is school improvement teams. Those of you who are familiar with your PTAs and your PTOs know that in some school districts and in some schools, it is very difficult to get parents to be part of a PTA or PTO. That might be true of school improvement teams. You may not find sufficient parental involvement at the school site level. And, you know, again, from a collective bargaining perspective, the statute, as it currently exists, requires participation by certified union members and non-certified union members. So if we end up in Massachusetts, those people are elected by their peers in that building. If you end up with a process where you don't have sufficient parental in participation at the site level, that could be a recipe for disaster. Well, I mean, I think that and if you look at a lot of I think it's a cautionary note, but if you look at a lot of the information, distributed leadership has a better sense of, so we talked earlier about curriculum frameworks. If you've got a good principal and a good school improvement team that understand the dynamics of the student population that they're dealing with, then they'll adjust their curriculum within the context of the frameworks to address those students and address those needs. If you've got one size fits all coming from central office, that might not work. Having said that, the real danger is if a principal doesn't really understand the budgeting process, they get an allocation. Central office and the school committee allocates X amount of dollars for that building based on a lot of factors. The age of the population of the teachers. They have a lot of teachers at the top step, they're going to get more money. So that's recognized. But if you fail to take into account the nuances of budgeting, you may expend all your money in one given area and neglect other parts of it. So if it's on professional development, you might not have the resources to get the technology you need. Well, like I said, there are benefits to it, but technically we haven't seen the version of the bill that's in a cloak of secrecy under the cone of silence at the State House.
So I think one of the things that I would say is that it's important for us to focus on Massachusetts because it's right up the road. But there has been a lot of attention to site-based management as if it was invented in Massachusetts. It wasn't. And as if that's the only place it's ever been tried out, which is also not accurate. When you look at the experience, the literature on this over the past 30 years, that literature talks about, first, one of the things that Tim's identified, which is the closer you get decision-making down to the level where it's going to have an impact, the more likely people are to be invested in the process of decision-making. One of the questions is, how do we redesign the relationship between principals and superintendents so that superintendents have some level of supervisory role over aspects of this, but we reshape the power base of principals and get them to do business. If I was going to summarize the literature on site-based management, the advantages are people get much more involved, both the community gets much more involved and the employees get much more involved in decision-making about what they're going to do in their home. And as you bring more people into the process, they get vested in the outcomes, and so you get a lot more enthusiasm about actually going and implementing successfully the decisions that have been made. And depending upon the size of the district, sometimes it can feel as if the superintendent is in some other state rather than in a different piece of the town. So the research, remembering that mostly site-based management has been implemented where there are people who think it's a really good idea. So they're more likely to end up with success, but the report out is where they have tried it, you improve employee morale, you improve parental involvement, you challenge some of the pre-existing relationships and decision-making processes, and any kind of challenge to that may be an improvement. It may yield much better outcomes in terms of student performance. That's the good news about it. And Tim has, I think, accurately identified some of the challenges. You need to think about, I'm not aware that there's a timeline yet for implementation. Not a single one of us ensured that principals were selected on the basis of their budget acumen. So do you have the right people in the right seats on the bus? And if you don't, how are you going to train them up so that they're ready? And that has been one of the real challenges in moving to site-based management, is you got to get the people who are in the positions to have the skills that they need. And they need personnel and budget and team management skills. Those three arenas, if you look at the curriculum for training both teachers and principals, those are not strong elements of the curriculum. And so if you have people in place who are ready to do this, they got ready in some way other than out of their formal education. I say that as somebody who has 2 more weeks as a member of the faculty at Rhode Island College. It's a challenge, and frankly, Rhode Island College is in the middle of trying to respond to some of the challenges that accrue as a result of the changes. Yep, Marianne? Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Sorry, thank you. I thought I could just offer some perspective, if you don't mind. Laurie McEwan, East Greenwich. I have the perspective of, first of all, being a teacher. In 1991, I started After Mass Education Reform Act in 1992, I sat on the first school-based council at my school, and we found it extremely refreshing. We were the only Title I school in my district, facing major challenges, different population than the rest of the district. And it was a wonderful participatory process that brought us closer to reaching our goals and developing a strong strategic plan. I also sit as an assistant superintendent right now in Massachusetts, and so I see this played out on a daily basis. I think the concerns about principals and their budgets and them being islands is a little bit unfounded. Our district still works in a very collaborative way with the superintendent, assistant superintendent, and budget director meeting frequently with our principals and on everything. We do curriculum collaboratively and cohesively. We work with them on their budgets. All kinds of things are developed as a group. We meet every other week as a leadership council, and the superintendent and I are in buildings constantly working with principals through their concerns and questions, and we've hired some brand new principals and just developed them the best that we can. But they're strong. They have a sense of urgency around their own buildings. They understand the finances, the curriculum, and the students in their own buildings. The hiring and firing power for principals can't be underscored. When they know that they're serving as a chief executive in that way, they make very strong decisions about their teachers. They'll come to us when they have concerns or questions. And by the same token, the superintendent having that hiring, firing power of almost everyone in the district, except for, interestingly, me. The budget director and the special ed director were all hired by the school committee, at least in the town where I live. But what we know about how students achieve, John Hattie has done extensive research on the effect size of various interventions for students. And the highest efficacy size is about collective efficacy. The belief of the teachers in the building that they together can improve the learning of students. So when you have site-based management, you have a team that's working together collectively, closest to that locus of control with the students, the teachers being the closest, you see efficacy rise. And so site-based management has to happen. We can't have all of these levels of intervention away from the level of the student. And just to speak anecdotally, I am so in favor of us being removed from hiring and firing, homeschool decisions, all of this other stuff that I think isn't our purview as school committee members.
So one of the purposes of having this facilitated discussion is for the executive committee to hear from all of you about, are there questions that need to be answered in order for the association to feel comfortable in its voice into the General Assembly? Are there concerns, because some of those concerns might be addressed in modifications of the bill being introduced? So the remainder of this is really about you saying what your questions are, and Tim may have the answer to those questions, and then are there concerns? Yes.
Hi, Emily Copeland, Portsmouth. We do a lot of this already, so I don't think it would be a huge shift for us. But my one concern is with the school improvement teams, and maybe you know the answer here. Are those now open meetings? Are they public? Because if they're hiring if they're hiring teachers, I mean, does that mean?
The school improvement team does not hire and fire teachers.
But they recommend.
No. They work on strategic planning. They make, some curricular decisions, but they're not involved, at least in our,
This
bill calls for
would
that.
get them involved in
Right.
recommending budgets and recommending hires.
Right, because when I served on the school improvement team at the elementary level, we did a lot with student data and looking at how students were learning. And one, I have a little bit of privacy concerns if those then become public meetings. But also, if they are involved in budgeting and like if they're determining the budget for the building, that should be public, right? So now if these are public meetings, we're basically, I guess that would be my concern, something I would like to see thought about a little bit more.
So let's take that as an open question.
Yeah.
And that we currently have open meetings law that speaks to that question. How is that going to impact decision-making within a school improvement team? I think that's an important question.
Yeah, I have asked that question of the sponsors and of legislative leadership are school improvement teams required to adhere to the open meeting law? And if in fact they are, does it extend logically that they would then have to meet the code of ethics and have to file ethics statements? That presents a problem. The Common Cause seems to think the school improvement teams, as they exist presently, have to meet the requirements of the open meeting law. But I'm waiting for somebody to call Attorney General Noronha and ask Attorney General Noronha, are these organizations, even though they're advisory in terms of hiring and in terms of budget, are they in fact required to meet the open meeting law requirements?
So that's an excellent question. Are there other questions or reactions to this legislation?
I have two. Mary Morse from Situate, also a relative newbie to the school committee thing. First of all, we are just beginning negotiations for a 3-year collective bargaining agreement. So the impact of that, on collective bargaining agreements in place. And secondly, if we're asking principals to take on significant added responsibility, what is the financial impact of that?
So there is language in the soon-to-be proposed legislation which says that agreements within labor management bargaining. So this is not going to supersede a contract that is either being negotiated or has already been negotiated.
So by beginning the negotiation, I'm sorry. Just to clarify, so by beginning the negotiation process, if we come to an agreement before this is implemented, then what is contained in that CBA will be honored.
The language specifically exempts school improvement teams and principals from collective bargaining. So one of the issues about allowing a principal to select their staff, well, if you have job fairs within the collective bargaining process, the principal will be limited by and large to hiring new personnel coming into the district. As far as I can read, it adheres to the collective bargaining requirements. So if you have a job fair and somebody is a senior teacher, even if that principal doesn't want that person in his or her building, they don't have any control over it. The seniority process will take precedent, and the job fair process will take precedent.
Other questions? Yes. Wait until Tim gets to you.
So, not to be too negative about this, but the biggest problem that I see with Rhode Island's approach to trying to emulate Massachusetts is we cherry pick bits and pieces of Massachusetts' success story without realizing that Massachusetts looked at it holistically. It was not just a graduation requirement. It was not just extra funding to the schools. It was not just extra evaluation of teachers. It was everything. But we're cherry picking little bits and pieces of it and trying to take site-based management as an approach. We're not even implementing it the same way that Massachusetts did and expecting to achieve similar results. If we're doing site-based management, but the principals don't have the ability to hire and fire because the collective bargaining agreements supersede that ability, we're not going to get any of the benefits of site-based management. And if site-based management is based on other ancillary requirements that support it, then we're not going to get that benefit. So my problem with the General Assembly's approach to a lot of this is they're not doing what Massachusetts did, which was look at it holistically and hit every single piece. We could throw another $100 million at education. We're not going to achieve what Massachusetts did. We could have greater graduation requirements. We're not going to achieve what they did. They looked at it as a large problem and hit every area, but with a long-range goal. I think what the Rhode Island Foundation is trying to do is the right approach, but we've still got the General Assembly doing exactly what Tim is alluding to as a bad idea, which is the headline grabbing approach. Site-based management is not in and of itself what it allowed Massachusetts to achieve what it achieved. Neither is any of the other individual pieces. We're asking people to go out and get 2x4s at Home Depot, and that's going to build a house. without the foundation, without the electrician, without all the rest of it. So I see some major implementation problems with this if we're expecting to achieve Massachusetts accomplishments with just little bits and pieces, not even well thought through.
So let me pursue for just a moment. If we disengage this conversation from Massachusetts, clearly its origins are in the comparison with Massachusetts. But if we disengage that and we look at site-based management as an option for governance here in Rhode Island, without regard to it will magically transform public education. Do you have the same concern about site-based management? Because mostly you focused on not comprehensive. I think that that's a fair concern to have. On what's your position with regard to site-based management?
Well, if you're going to implement it without, just as the example that Tim gave, if the collective bargaining agreement supersede the ability of the chief executive officer of the building to make those hiring and firing decisions, what is it?
Okay.
Just you know, to put this in context a little bit, all of the reforms in Massachusetts, and we have my counterpart from Massachusetts, Glen Kuchar, who'll go over what happened in Mass. One of the things that happened in 1993 in Massachusetts is their state Supreme Court ruled that students have a constitutional right to an education. As a result of that, taking the Massachusetts Business Council's recommendations, the legislature, within 60 days of that ruling, ended up passing the Massachusetts Reform Act, which incorporated site-based management, which incorporated high-stakes testing, which had more rigorous teacher evaluation, and at the time, I believe, it required testing to be part of their evaluation process. That was in 1993. The governor, who was a fiscal conservative, committed to investing $2 billion over several years to bring the poorest school districts up to speed. In 1993 actually, Pawtucket and Woonsocket, based on the success in Massachusetts, filed suit in Superior Court alleging that our reliance on property taxes placed a burden on districts that could not fund education. And as a result, those students were not getting an adequate education, a meaningful education, or an equitable education. And that, in turn, violated the Equal Protection Clause in Article 1 of our Constitution. In 1993, a Superior Court judge agreed with them, said, yes, it's absolutely atrocious. Thousands of dollars less are invested in those students in those two communities. Our Supreme Court in 1995, and ironically, an opinion by Justice Letterberg, who, when she was a state senator, was a champion for special education students, said, in essence, there is no right to an education. Article 12 of our Constitution does not guarantee an education to be meaningful, equitable, or adequate. In fact, the framers of the Constitution, at that time they framed it, and in subsequent years, made no provision for anyone in the state of Rhode Island to have an education. So what's happened since then, and part of the Mass miracle or the Mass grand bargain, is a result of a student having the ability to walk into Superior Court in Massachusetts and sue for the right to an education. That does not exist in Rhode Island. And while I've got the mic, I'm going to make a little pitch and a little plea.
We are shocked that
Shocked.
you're going to do this.
On Wednesday night of this upcoming week, May 1st, when we've all had our May breakfasts, the legislature will convene at the rise of the legislature, which is about 5 o'clock. The Education Committee will convene, and they will hear our proposal to put forward a referendum on next year's ballot to make education a constitutionally protected right. If you have the time, I strongly urge you to show up and support that proposal, because in my estimation, until that happens, until a student can walk into a court and say, I'm being shortchanged, The state is shortchanging me on my education. We're going to continue to have these disparities and these inequities, and we're not going to be able to get to where we need to get. I'm sorry for filibustering.
Like I said, shocking.
Carolyn Mark, I'm chair of the school committee in East Greenwich. I think we need to talk about collective bargaining agreements that would get in the way of principals' ability to be able to hire and fire. Under Deborah Gist in the development of the basic education plan, it was our understanding in East Greenwich that using job fairs and making hiring decisions that were primarily based on seniority was a violation of the BEP because you were not putting necessarily the best person in any particular job. We went back to the bargaining table then and negotiated a criterion-based hiring process where seniority could be a factor, but all things would have to be equal for that to be able to kick in. I think, and then there was some chatter at this table here, well, who's still doing job fairs? And it's possible that school districts are in different places, and especially if you're at the front end of negotiating a contract and you haven't gotten there yet in terms of negotiating for criterion-based hiring and you're still running job fairs, that's absolutely something that needs to be looked at, because if the collective bargaining agreement is going to get in the way of site-based management, it's never going to work.
And I remember when Commissioner Gist came out with that provision, that interpretation. I will say, subsequent to that, the ability to do away with job fairs on through the collective bargaining process is back and forth. And quite honestly, the department hasn't really enforced that provision or that guidance since she issued it, since she left. I point to Central Falls as an example of that. I believe the collective bargaining agreement there still but still has an element of the job fair there. And that contract for a number of years was negotiated by Dave Abbott, who was a legal counsel and deputy commissioner. So, I mean, I think that you're right. The problem is that RIDE has been inconsistent in enforcing that. Just one other thing to think about, and I'm going to keep interrupting here. Our state Supreme Court did, however, in a case involving North Providence, which ironically the North Providence School Committee lost, they had eliminated reading coaches at the middle school and high school level. And they cited the rationale as a fiscal savings for the district. The union grieved it and went through the judiciary process and ended up in the state Supreme Court. But Justice Robinson, who was a former member of our association from East Greenwich, said that if the school committee had argued that in reorganizing the reading coaches and the English department had led to, or if you had claimed it was in the best interest of students as opposed to a monetary savings, they would have ruled the other way. So we have some limited authority under the Supreme Court. His language was acting in the essence of their educational mission. School committees cannot negotiate away through collective bargaining, basically the rights and interests of students. The only question I have about site-based management is if we devolve that control down to the local level, will that in some way, shape, or form negate Justice Robinson's ruling? And I'm sorry for going on at length.
I think we also need to think about the
Can you use the mic? Yeah.
the principals and job security. As it stands right now, I mean, it's not uncommon for the teachers in a building to gang up on a principal, and they have very little job protection. They can be non-renewed just because we think we can do better. And I think that's very daunting for a lot of our principals.
Hi, Paul Demonica from Cumberland. Wouldn't this be easy if we just beg forgiveness from Massachusetts and ask them to take the state back? I think it would solve a lot of problems.
And you assume that forgiveness would be given.
We will fund that study. So not my place to interfere with this debate. I just did want to make one informational comment because it's come up about, are principals equipped, are they trained to do this? For the last 2 years, there have been 2 very robust principal training programs going on in the state with a lot of your principals I know the initials, NISL and CLE. One is for existing principals, one's for emerging principals. We've funded a big chunk of it, and others have funded it. But I just did want to mention that a lot of the principals at your schools are going through these. You can find out and opine on the quality of it, but the fact is that it's acknowledged that the principals do need the support and the training.
That's a good addition. So are there, I lost my runner here. Are there other questions or concerns about this? Because in the end, the executive committee needs to have a sense of where you as a body are.
So, Marianne Role, I'm been on the school committee in Lincoln for 15 years, and we have put in place some of the pieces of this governance structure. I mean, our budgeting begins at the building level, it moves up. So there's input from teachers and principals in the budget process. We did away with the job fair, so we have similar language to East Greenwich. I do have concerns about the role of RIDE in this piece. You know, leadership at the state level. I don't want the General Assembly to become the Board of Ed, or to be the leader. You know, to leading. We don't want to go there. But on the other hand, I think many of us in this room have felt that over the past several years, because of a variety of reasons, we haven't felt the leadership from RIDE. And part of that may have to do with their capacity. I absolutely have the same concerns, though, about the collective bargaining agreement. We also have hired several new principals in the last year or so, and I see a hunger on the part of some of those younger principals, those new principals, to do this work. And so empowering them, again, through legislation, I think would be useful. We've got to get to the point where it's not hit and miss. We're too small a state. You know, if there's a good model for school governance, we ought to take the chance and invest in it and see if we can't make it work. I do want to say one thing about the SIT teams, the school improvement teams, and the role of parents. I go back to an age in the early 90s. I was very involved in PTA at the local and state level. And when school improvement teams came along, one of the things we saw statewide is that parents left the PTA organization and took a seat on the SIT. And I'm convinced that they did that because they saw that's where there was some power, some authority, some voice. And at the PTA or the PTO, it was about the cookies and the brownies and nice social events. That was appropriate for parents. And there were parents then who were ready to take to have a larger role in their local schools. So I think while there are challenges today, especially in some communities where parents are less likely to feel comfortable in school or to see that as a place where they might have a role, I think there is an openness to that as well, and we could find a way to do it, given the concerns that Tim has raised about open meetings and ethics filings. God, we're never going to get parents if they have to file the ethics every April. So, you know, but it's those kinds of, that seems like little stuff when you think about the advantages that Scott outlined in the beginning in terms of what's, you know, moving management, putting more authority at the local level might actually have in terms of getting good results for kids. And again, I think that should be, for me, that's if that comes with this effort, then it makes working through the nitty-gritty details to get there.
Any comments or questions that haven't been voiced thus far? Because what you're doing is really providing the grist for the executive committee to look more carefully at this.
Hi, Dianne Cardio-Bowdy, Westerly. One thing that I was, when you were speaking and you consistently said in conjunction with the superintendent, which I think is a good point to make, because if we have strong superintendents, they're going to welcome strengthening their building leads. Whereas if you have a weaker superintendent, they may be threatened by that, and maybe that could be a formula for your district to move forward. That's all.
So Megan Douglas from Barrington. Likewise, we do many of these things already, and I had actually spoken to our superintendent about this last week, and one of our primary concerns was around facilities. We're a really small district. We have 6 schools, and we're having a hard time imagining our school principals, which already have incredibly full plates, addressing things like facilities, right? Like, I understand they manage like drips and, plug toilets, I get that. But like the bigger picture of facility management is very time consuming and specialized. And so that was actually one of his primary concerns was how do we, all of our principals are doing NISL. I have complete faith that they can pretty much do anything, although I'm really concerned about the SIT stepping in to hiring and firing. But the facilities was really a concern, so I just want to.
One of the things that emerged out of that literature on site-based management was that they collected data about how principals spent their time before site-based management and how principals spent their time after site-based management came in, and there were substantive reprioritization of principals' time, that they clearly added stuff to their plate. My guess is that many of you feel as if your principal's plate is already pretty full, and so some things ended up not being prioritized. One of the concerns that ended up with some site-based management districts and states was that educational leadership didn't get quite the priority because you're now doing personnel and budget and facilities management. So you might end up, what a number of places did was they needed to rewrite the job description for principals, providing some input into what needs most to be prioritized. And what some districts found was that single administrator schools sometimes needed more administrative time because you've added a bunch of stuff, and if the principal was fully booked and couldn't find somebody to delegate stuff to, you just needed more administrative time. What you're doing is pushing out of central administration. That raises questions about whether you can thin central administration. I'll leave you to think about what fun that would be.
And just one point, and my colleague Glen Kuchar from Mass will talk a little bit more about site-based management and some of the challenges. Massachusetts has a quarter-century start on us in terms of site-based management. So when we look at it from that context, there are going to be some issues and there are going to be some problems. I think most school districts have a process right now that allows for the principal to be responsible for hiring new teachers coming in.
Right.
Not all. I think the biggest problem is going to be, the biggest challenge is going to be for our urban school districts. And I think that's where you're going to see the bigger part of the problem about how things are done and what the responsibilities are. I go back to a period of time when the mayor of Providence, when Buddy Cianci, criteria for hiring building administrators was predicated on how many fundraising tickets they had bought in the prior year. So I mean, there are challenges there. The state is intervening in Providence. The outgoing superintendent there has cited the bureaucracy's interference with the school department as one of the reasons that he's leaving, and the inability of Providence to improve on its test scores. And that's been like that. And I worked in the city, not for Buddy Cianci, I worked in the mayor's office for close to 8 years. And I can tell you that even with a mayor who was not quite as controversial as Buddy, there was a lot of interference in the school department. So those are the challenges going forward. And if Providence doesn't succeed, I think as a whole, the state's going to suffer.
As Tim is walking to the next speaker, let me just identify, we have about 5 more minutes. So part of my job is to make sure we end on time so that Tim can start on time. So if there are any ideas that haven't been voiced yet, and we're in the last couple of minutes to do that.
I would just say that if any changes are going to come from the State House, that if it's going to apply to the public schools, it must apply to the charter schools, because they have so much sway over what we're doing here. I mean, Cumberland has to get our budget approved by the town council. Theirs doesn't get approved by anybody but themselves. And there has to be a model that they're just as transparent. Thank you.
Thank you.
I would just second the comment from Barrington, because like we have 4 schools and 2 of them are single administrator. And even when the evaluation system came out, that was a huge burden on that administration. And I think it's so important for them to be the educational leaders. I don't want us to be duplicating, you know, more administration staff. So I'm a little worried about that.
And I will say that there is some concerns. The intervention part of the legislation, which I've had an opportunity to look at, if the state has a failing school and through all the protocols leading up to the direct intervention by the state where they appoint a special master to take over that school.
Marianne,
If
do
that
you need
person
anything else?
decides that one of the turnaround strategies is to lengthen the school year or to lengthen the school day, if they can't come to terms with the union, it goes to binding arbitration.
Hi, I'm Kate Mazzanti from South Kingstown. As I hear this, at the moment, I'm having heart failure because if anybody knows what's happening in our town right now, we're kind of in a state of turmoil, and I might even go as far to say crisis with our administrative team. And I guess my concern would be you would need to have some sort of recovery plan for a community that right now we're down a superintendent, we're down an assistant superintendent, we're down a director of special ed, we're down 3 principals, like we're
Principals in a middle school. 3 elementary principals in a middle
So my concern when I look at this is there's like a level of trust that doesn't exist in our community at the moment, at our table, between our community and our table, between our we're in a mess. And so I would love to make sure that there would be some sort of like, okay, this community here, we need to come in and help them figure this out. We've just voted to put our personnel assignment team policy into CBA. Well, we didn't, but. So I have a little panic attack while I'm listening to this. A year ago, it would have been a different story where we are now. So I think a contingency plan for a community that may be struggling might be a good factor.
And at some level, I think that that's a capacity issue at the State Department of Education level, because as Tim said, their budget's been cut, their personnel have been cut. It's an annual experience there, so that and you need to have the people to provide that level of support. It's a fair concern. Any other comments?
Yes. Yes. One thing I've seen over the years, I've been on the committee now going on my 13th year, through the governance that we have on the committee now with ethics, and we have made a great change in nepotism. When you bring things into the school now, if they are not governed by the same regulations that we are, you are opening it back up to nepotism. And that was huge when I came on 12 years ago. And if you bring that back, there's nothing that you're going to do that's going to bring the education levels of our students back up. They're going to tank the same way they were 12 years ago. And that's something that they're going to have to look at. They're going to have to put regulations. Because if you take away any restrictions on them, it's going to go back to the way it was. That's all.
Okay, thank you.
Again, Luke Murray from Coventry. I think we've discussed and we're in support of this. And the thing is that we've experienced already in the past year where the superintendent has passed down some of this responsibility to the administrators in the building, including budgeting. And we've seen the culture change that has happened already. When you empower people, we are hiring professional administrators with high credentials. They make good salaries. We have to trust them to do their job. And don't let the great be the enemy of the good. I said it earlier, you know, I want to walk and chew gum. We have to look at the long-term plan, but the truth is that we need to do something now, start making these incremental changes. We can tweak them as they go, but just to say that it's not the best thing doesn't mean that we don't do anything. And I think that we're all in support of moving this ball forward, because empowering the people at the local level, we all talk about the state interfering with the local levels of government. We all, I think, in this room feel that the school committee should be empowered, so why should it be any different for our administrators? And so I think we're all in favor of this and hope it moves forward.
Thank you. We're
Yeah,
down to the last two or three comments.
If I've conveyed that we're opposed to it, we're not. I'm just, if you've ever seen that Al Cap, Little Abner, that cartoon, which I don't know if exists anymore, there was a character that used to
When
walk around with a
exactly
rain
were
cloud
you
over his
born,
head.
Tim?
That's me.
You got to be over 60 to know Little Abner.
Only 60, huh?
I think for the most part, I have a hard time believing anybody disagrees with the principles that are laid out in site-based management. I mean, aside from everything that's been discussed, there's been tons of books written in the last 20 years around the business community, around decentralization of decision-making. The concern that I end up having with all of this stuff at the end of the day is it's not clear how any of it's funded. Change isn't free. And you know, it's hard to not want to do something because of the money, but it's also hard to do something when you don't know how you offset those expenses. It costs money to train. It costs money to backfill. I mean, if there are principals that are stretched thin, they're going to need building administrative support to handle facilities management. Where does that money come from? So these priorities, do they take away from what is most important for all of us, which is the student? So I just hope that as all of this good work continues, that there's some alignment with budget and funding so that it's not up to the district to figure it out and to make even more challenging decisions potentially based on the outcome.
Thank you.
And I will tell you that a sneak peek of the entire comprehensive reform package, which is running to 80 pages now, there is a section that opens up the Joint Committee on a foundation-based formula. So something that we've pushed for the last couple of years, Representative Amore and Senator Pearson may actually, we haven't seen the final version of it, but the sneak peek I got would suggest that they're going to reconstitute the Joint Committee on a foundation-based formula to take a look at all of these issues and to take a look at what needs to be included in the formula as opposed to being what is funded categorically. And the problem with categorical funding is it can be easily frozen at a set level, so you don't get that. But
We have time for one more comment. That's how you ought to leave it? We've heard every idea. Thank you all very much.
okay.